porcelain rattled a brittle, pathetic sound, cutting through the heavy oak and leather silence of the study. Fiona clamped her back teeth together, tasting the faint, metallic tang of old blood on her bitten tongue. She forced her right hand to grip the handle of the silver coffee tray, harder, her knuckles turning bone-white. Her left arm hung uselessly at her side, buried deep within the oversized folds of a charcoal wool cardigan she had dug out of the lost and found bin. Beneath the cheap, scratchy fabric, her forearm throbbed in a sick, synchronized rhythm with her racing heart. A jagged, hot spike of agony radiated from her wrist up to her elbow, with every step she took across the thick Persian rug. It felt like her marrow had been replaced with crushed glass. Kieran sat behind the massive mahogany desk, a silhouette framed by the grey morning light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. He didn't look up. He rarely did. A man like Kieran Hayes didn't need to look at the help to know they were there. He breathed the air in his estate like a predator scenting its territory. The scratch of his fountain pen against heavy parchment was rhythmic, precise, and utterly indifferent to the world outside his ledgers. He smelled of stale black coffee, expensive cedar wood, and the faint, permanent undertone of gunpowder that clung to his tailored suits. Fiona dragged her left foot slightly, just a fraction of an inch, a microscopic concession to the blinding pain shooting through her side where a steel-toed boot had caught her ribs 12 hours earlier. The pen stopped. Kieran didn't raise his head, but the sudden absence of that scratching sound was louder than a gunshot. "You're breathing like a dying dog," Kieran murmured. His voice was low, gravelly, stripped of any warmth. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. Cold. Factual. Fiona swallowed hard, her throat clicking dryly. "Apologies, sir. Catching a cold." She reached the edge of the desk. The tray was heavy. Too heavy for one hand, but she couldn't risk lifting the left. She leaned her hip against the polished wood, trying to use her body weight as leverage to slide the tray onto the desk without tipping the fragile china cups. A sharp spike of pain lashed up her hidden arm as the sleeve brushed the edge of the desk. She gasped a sharp, involuntary hiss of air, and her right hand jerked. The silver tray slammed down onto the wood with a jarring clang. Hot black coffee sloshed over the rim of the pot, pooling darkly on the pristine blotter, inches from Kieran's documents. Fiona froze. The silence in the room instantly turned suffocating. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. She scrambled with her right hand, grabbing a linen napkin from the tray to dab frantically at the spreading stain. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Hayes. I'll clean it. I'll get a towel." Kieran slowly raised his eyes. They were dark, the color of wet slate, and entirely devoid of pity. He watched her frantic one-handed scrubbing. He watched the way sweat beaded at her hairline, matting the stray strands of dull brown hair to her pale forehead. He watched the way her left shoulder was hiked up near her ear, rigid, locked in a permanent flinch, while the left sleeve of the cardigan hung strangely straight, bulkier than it should be. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life dismantling human beings. He knew what a lie looked like. He knew what fear smelled like. But more importantly, he knew the mechanics of physical trauma. He had broken enough bones to recognize the precise, unnatural geometry of a defensive fracture. "Stop," he said. Fiona kept scrubbing, her breaths coming in short, panicked hitches. "It's almost up. I can fix it." I said, "Stop." He didn't raise his voice, but the command carried a physical weight that pinned her to the spot. Fiona dropped the sodden napkin. Her right hand hovered awkwardly in the air. She stared at the stain, unable to look at his face. Kieran pushed his chair back. The leather groaned. He stood up. He wasn't a towering giant of a man, but he carried a density that warped the gravity in the room. He moved slowly around the edge of the desk, his footsteps silent on the rug. Fiona's instinct screamed at her to step back to run, but her legs felt like lead. She pressed her spine against the edge of the desk, trapping herself. The smell of cedar and cold anger washed over her. He stopped inches from her. He didn't look at her face. His gaze was fixed on the oversized grey sleeve of her left arm. "Take the sweater off." "I'm cold, sir," she lied. The sweat running down her neck betrayed her instantly. "Fiona," Kieran said, tasting the name. He barely knew it. She was just a ghost who brought coffee and emptied ashtrays. "Take the goddamn sweater off or I will cut it off you." She closed her eyes. Defeat washed over her, heavier than the pain. Her right hand reached over, trembling violently, and fumbled with the top button of the cardigan. It took her 3 tries to slip it through the hole. She pushed the fabric off her right shoulder. Then, with agonizing slowness, she shimmied the thick wool down her left side. She couldn't bend the elbow. She had to drag the sleeve down her rigid, swollen forearm. A low, pathetic whimper escaped her lips as the friction dragged against the raw skin underneath. The sweater fell to the floor in a heap. Fiona stood in her thin white undershirt. Her left arm was exposed in the harsh grey light. Kieran stared. The muscles in his jaw locked, a hard ridge forming beneath his skin. He didn't gasp. He didn't offer a word of comfort. His reaction was entirely internal, a cold, black drop of venom leaking into his stomach. The arm was a grotesque canvas of violence. From the wrist to midway past the elbow, the flesh was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The skin stretched taut and shiny. It was painted in sickening hues of mottled purple, deep, furious black, and a sickly, jaundiced yellow at the edges. But the colour wasn't what made Kieran's breath turn shallow. It was the angle. About 3 inches above the wrist, the forearm bowed inward in a sickening, unnatural curve. It wasn't splintered. It wasn't cast. It was wrapped tightly, desperately in grey duct tape over a glossy magazine she had clearly scavenged from the recycling bin. The tape dug into the swollen flesh, cutting off circulation, making her fingers look like pale, bloated sausages. "Who did this?" Kieran asked. His voice had dropped an octave. It sounded like stones grinding together underwater. Fiona looked away, staring at the bookshelf over his shoulder. "I fell. On the ice behind the kitchen. Coming in this morning. It's May, Fiona. It hasn't frozen in 2 months. I slipped on grease. The grease trap leaked." She was rambling now, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I put my arm out to catch myself and it snapped. I'm fine. I can work. Please, Mr. Hayes, I need the hours. I can work one-handed. I won't spill anything again, I swear to God." Kieran reached out. He didn't grab her. He just placed his fingertips lightly, barely brushing the skin just above the duct tape. Fiona flinched so hard, she hit the desk behind her. A ragged sob tore from her throat. "A fall breaks the wrist," Kieran said, his tone clinical flat. He was dissecting the lie with the precision of a surgeon. A scaphoid fracture, sometimes the distal radius. The break is low. It snaps from the impact of the ground. He traced a finger in the air, mimicking the violent curve of her forearm. "This is an ulnar shaft fracture. Mid-bone. It only happens one way." He finally looked up, meeting her terrified, tear-filled eyes. "It happens when you raise your arm to protect your skull from a blunt object. A bat, a pipe, a crowbar." He took half a step closer. The air in the room felt thick, highly combustible. "I won't ask you again, Fiona. Who put a pipe to my employee? It wasn't compassion driving him." Kieran Hayes didn't do compassion. It was a deeply ingrained, almost primitive sense of ownership. This woman mopped his floors. She breathed his air. She was a fixture in his house. Someone had walked up to a fixture in his territory and taken a hammer to it. It was an insult, a blatant, roaring disrespect that demanded a balancing of the scales. Fiona shook her head, tears finally spilling over her lashes, cutting clean tracks through the dust and sweat on her cheeks. "If I tell you they'll kill my brother, please just let me go back to work." "Your brother," Kieran repeated, piecing the puzzle together instantly. "Dead." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The quiet sob that hitched in her chest was confirmation enough. "Who holds the paper? You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's not just one guy. It was a crew. They cornered me after my shift at the diner last night. They said Tommy owed them 30 grand. They said the arm was the interest. They said next week they take his kneecaps, and if I tell the cops, they take my eyes." "I'm not the cops," Kieran said. The sheer barren truth in that statement made Fiona shudder. He watched her for a long moment. She was trembling violently now, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving nothing but shock and agony. She looked small, broken and utterly useless to him as a maid. But as a catalyst, she was perfect. "Names?" Kieran demanded. "Sullivan," she choked out, defeated. She slumped against the desk, her good hand clutching her ribs. "Declan Sullivan, and his boys, the ones who run the chop shops down by the rail yard. There were 15 of them in the alley. They just stood there and laughed while he swung the pipe." Kieran stared at her. Declan Sullivan, a low-level bottom feeder who had been encroaching on the south side of Kieran's docks for 3 months. Kieran had been looking for an excuse to clean house. He hadn't expected the excuse to walk into his study carrying a silver tray and wrapped in duct tape. He turned his back on her, walking over to the heavy rotary phone sitting on the corner of the desk. He picked up the receiver and dialed 3 digits. "Dr. Evans," Kieran said into the mouthpiece, his eyes fixed on the rain outside. "Come up to the main study. Bring the bag. I have a compound ulnar fracture that needs setting, and likely some broken ribs." He hung up without waiting for a reply. Then he picked up a sleek, black cellular phone from his jacket pocket. He dialed another number. "Gage," Kieran said when the line clicked open. "Pull the vans around. Call the boys on the night shift. Wake them up." A pause on the other end. Then a rough voice asked, "Where are we going, boss?" "The railyard chop shops. Sullivan's crew." Kieran turned back to look at Fiona. She was sliding down the edge of the desk, her legs finally giving out, collapsing into a miserable heap on the Persian rug. She clutched her makeshift splint to her chest, rocking slightly, her eyes wide, with a mix of physical agony and dawning terror at what she had just unleashed. Kieran's expression didn't change. He felt no warmth, no heroic satisfaction. Just the cold, mechanical hum of impending violence. "Bring heavy plastic," Kieran said into the phone, his eyes never leaving Fiona's trembling form. "And bolt cutters. Nobody clocks out until that yard is empty." Dr. Evans smelled intensely of peppermint hard candies and surgical iodine. He was a small, wire-thin man in his late 60s who moved with an irritating, hurried efficiency. He didn't knock. He simply pushed open the heavy oak doors of the study, carrying a battered leather medical bag that looked older than he was. Fiona was still on the floor, her back pressed against the mahogany desk. Her teeth were chattering. The adrenaline had completely burned out of her system, leaving behind a cold, violent shivering that made the broken ends of her ulna grind together beneath her swollen flesh. Evans didn't speak to Kieran. He walked straight to Fiona, dropped his bag onto the Persian rug with a heavy, unceremonious thud, and knelt, "Let's get you off the floor," Evans muttered. He hooked his hands under her armpits. "Don't pull," Fiona gasped, her voice barely a dry wheeze. "Please don't pull." "I'm lifting, not pulling. Breathe through your nose." With surprising strength, the old doctor hauled her up. Fiona's vision greyed out. The room tilted violently, the bookshelves blurring into a dark, smeared line. By the time her vision cleared, she was lying flat on the leather Chesterfield sofa on the far side of the study. The smooth, cold leather bit through her thin undershirt. Kieran stood by the window, his back to the room. He was sliding a heavy black magazine into the grip of a Sig Sauer pistol. The metallic snick-clack of the weapon being chambered cut through the sound of the rain hitting the glass. He slipped the gun into a shoulder holster hidden beneath his suit jacket. "I have to cut this tape off," Evans said. He was pulling a pair of heavy trauma shears from his bag. "It's going to pull the skin. It's going to hurt." Fiona nodded weakly. She couldn't form words. She squeezed her eyes shut and grabbed a fistful of the leather cushion with her good hand. The first snip of the shears cutting through the thick silver duct tape sounded impossibly loud. Then came the tearing. The adhesive had bonded with the sweat and the swelling of her arm. As Evans peeled the tape back, it dragged the raw, distended skin with it. Fiona didn't scream. She whimpered a high, thin, pathetic sound trapped in the back of her throat. Tears leaked continuously from the corners of her eyes, pooling in her ears. When the makeshift magazine splint finally fell away, the smell hit the air. It was the faint copper scent of blood trapped under the skin, mixed with the sour tang of nervous sweat. Her forearm lay completely exposed against the dark leather. Without the tight compression of the tape, the unnatural bend in the bone became sickeningly pronounced. It looked like a piece of snapped kindling trying to poke through a bruised plum. Kieran turned from the window. He looked at the arm. His expression remained entirely blank, a terrifying void of emotion. He picked up his dark wool overcoat from a chair. "Don't!" Fiona choked out. Kieran paused, one arm in his coat sleeve. He looked down at her. "Don't do it," she whispered, her chest heaving as she tried to pull in oxygen. "If you go down there, if you kill them, it's my fault. I don't want this. I just wanted to keep my job. I'll pay them the 30 grand. I'll figure it out." "You make $12 an hour, Fiona," Kieran said flatly. "You couldn't pay off 30 grand if you worked here for a decade." "But they'll know I told you. They'll come back for Tommy." Kieran finished shrugging on his coat. He adjusted his collar, his movements precise and unhurried. "They won't come back for Tommy," Kieran said, his voice dropping to that low, gravelly register that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Dead men don't collect debts, and dead men don't swing pipes at people who belong to me. I don't belong to you," she sobbed, the denial torn from her out of sheer, desperate terror. "I just clean your floors." "You're under my roof," Kieran corrected, his slate-grey eyes locking onto hers. "That makes you mine to maintain." Sullivan walked up to my house and threw a rock through the window. Now I have to go burn his house down. It has absolutely nothing to do with your soul, Fiona. So stop crying over it. He turned on his heel. "Set it, Evans. Give her whatever she needs for the pain. Put her in one of the guest rooms on the 2nd floor. She doesn't leave this house until I get back. Understood?" Evans grunted, digging a glass vial and a syringe out of his bag. Kieran walked out, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind him. Fiona stared at the closed doors, a new, deeper kind of panic settling into her chest. The gang at the rail yard was a nightmare, but they were a chaotic, messy nightmare. Kieran Hayes was a machine. "Roll your sleeve up on the good arm," Evans instructed, flicking the syringe with his fingernail. "I'm pushing 10 milligrams of morphine." Once it hits, I'm pulling that bone back into place. You're going to want to bite down on this." He tossed a rolled-up leather belt onto her chest. Fiona stared at the ceiling. The heavy rhythmic thud of Kieran's car engine starting up echoed from the driveway outside. She placed the leather belt between her teeth. Gage drove the lead van with the headlights off. The rain had picked up, turning the pothole-cratered access road leading to the industrial rail yard into a slick ribbon of black mud. The windshield wipers squeaked rhythmically, smearing the water across the glass rather than clearing it. Inside the back of the cargo van, 6 men sat in absolute suffocating silence. They smelled of wet nylon gun oil and stale chewing tobacco. They didn't speak because there was nothing to discuss. They all knew the mechanics of a sweep. Kieran sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the towering, rusted silhouettes of the shipping containers stacking up against the grey night sky. He was resting his chin on his knuckles, 2 lookouts on the perimeter fence. Gage murmured his voice, a low rumble over the engine block. He was staring through a pair of thermal binoculars, steering with his left knee. One in a rusted-out Ford near the gate, one walking the fence line with a flashlight. Inside, looks like heat signatures for a dozen more in the main corrugated shed. They got the bay doors rolled down. "Take the walkers quietly," Kieran said. "I don't want a single gunshot outside that shed. Cut the chain link on the south side behind the container stacks. We pinch them inward." Gage put the van in park behind a crumbling concrete retaining wall 50 yards from the perimeter. "Copy that." The men poured out of the back of the van. There was no shouting, no dramatic racking of shotguns, just the soft, wet crunch of boots on gravel and the rustle of heavy tactical gear. Kieran stepped out into the rain. The cold water hit the back of his neck, sliding under his collar. It felt grounding. It washed away the cloying scent of blood and iodine from the study. He walked behind Gage, navigating the maze of discarded tires and rotting wooden pallets. Ahead of them, the lookout walking the fence line paused to light a cigarette. The brief flare of the match illuminated a young, pockmarked face under a soggy Yankees cap. Gage materialized from the shadows behind the man like a damp ghost. One thick arm wrapped around the lookout's throat, crushing the windpipe instantly to kill the shout. Gage's other hand drove a heavy suppressed pistol into the base of the man's skull. A dull thwump, no louder than a car door slamming, echoed in the rain. The lookout dropped into the mud, his cigarette hissing out in a puddle. At the gate, 2 other men from Kieran's crew dragged a limp body out of the rusted Ford. "Perimeter clear," Gage whispered over the radio strapped to his chest. "Cut the fence," Kieran ordered. The heavy metallic snap of bolt cutters biting through thick steel chain link was swallowed by a sudden roll of distant thunder. Gage pulled the cut fence back, creating a ragged hole just large enough for a man to slip through. They moved across the yard, fanning out as they approached the main corrugated steel shed. Faint tinny music leaked from the thin walls, mingling with the harsh, sputtering blue light of a welding torch, filtering underneath the rolled-down bay doors. The smell of the place was overpowering ozone, burnt rubber raw gasoline, and spilled beer. Kieran stopped at the side access door. He tried the handle. Unlocked. Arrogance. He didn't draw his weapon. He let Gage and the others stack up around the door, their suppressed rifles raised and ready. Kieran simply reached out and pushed the heavy metal door open. The interior of the chop shop was blindingly bright lit by hanging industrial halogens. Car parts were scattered everywhere, like the bones of metal beasts. In the center of the concrete floor, a half-dismantled Mercedes sat on cinder blocks. Around a folding card table, littered with empty bottles and greasy wrappers, sat Declan Sullivan and 4 of his lieutenants. 7 other men were scattered around the garage, 2 by the welding tanks, 3 pulling an engine block from a Honda, and 2 sleeping on a dirty couch against the far wall. Declan was laughing. He was a thick, bull-necked man with a receding hairline and a tribal tattoo bleeding out from the collar of his stained t-shirt. He was tossing a handful of crumpled 20s onto the center of the table. "I'm telling you," Declan barked, his voice grating and loud. "The bitch practically pissed herself. Tomorrow night we grab the brother, break his knee, and we'll get the 30 grand by Friday." Kieran stepped over the threshold. His polished leather shoes clicked sharply against the greasy concrete. The sound wasn't loud, but the shift in the room's atmospheric pressure was instantaneous. The laughter died in Declan's throat. The man beside the welding torch killed the flame. The sudden silence in the massive shed was deafening, save for the rain hammering on the tin roof. Declan looked up, his eyes narrowing, as he tried to process the man in the tailored overcoat standing in the doorway. Then he saw Gage stepping out of the shadows behind Kieran, a suppressed rifle leveled directly at Declan's chest. The other shadows in the garage began to move as Kieran's men flowed into the room from the side door and the rear emergency exit, an encroaching tide of black tactical gear. "Who the hell are you?" Declan demanded, his hand instinctively dropping toward his waistband. "Hands on the table, Declan," Kieran said. His voice didn't echo. It was quiet, dense, and absolute. Declan froze. He looked at the laser dot painting the center of his chest. Slowly, he placed his meaty, grease-stained hands flat on the folding table. "This is Southside territory." Declan tried, his voice cracking slightly as the reality of the ambush set in. "You got no business pulling guns in here. Who are you?" Kieran walked forward, slowly, ignoring the men around the room, who were currently being zip-tied and forced to their knees by his crew. He walked right up to the folding table. He looked down at the crumpled $20 bills, then at Declan's thick, dirty fingers. "You use a steel pipe," Kieran stated. It wasn't a question. Declan swallowed hard. "What?" "When you collect interest, you use a heavy steel pipe." Kieran picked up an empty beer bottle from the table. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the cheap glass. It takes a very specific, cowardly kind of leverage to snap an ulnar shaft in half. It takes a man who likes the sound of a woman crying. The blood drained entirely from Declan's face. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a raw, suffocating panic. "Wait. You're Hayes. Listen, Jesus, listen. We didn't know she worked for you. She was just some waitress from the diner. We didn't know." "You still don't know," Kieran said. He dropped the beer bottle. It shattered against the concrete. Before Declan could flinch, Kieran grabbed the man's right hand, the hand still resting on the table, and drove the heel of his own heavy boot down onto Declan's wrist with the full force of his body weight. The sound of the bone shattering was a wet, sickening crack that echoed over the rain. Declan screamed a high, tearing sound, collapsing out of his chair and hitting the grease-stained floor. He clutched his ruined wrist, thrashing like a gaffed fish. Kieran looked down at him, his face perfectly impassive. "Gage," Kieran said softly over the screaming. "Yeah, boss." "Bring the heavy plastic. We're closing this yard down." Morphine left a thick metallic film on the back of the tongue, like the residue from sucking on an old copper penny. Fiona woke to that taste, blinking against the harsh, dry heat radiating from the guest room's baseboard heaters. She didn't know what time it was. Heavy blackout curtains the color of bruised plums smothered the windows, trapping the room in an artificial, velvet-lined midnight. The mattress beneath her was absurdly soft, swallowing her weight in high thread-count Egyptian cotton that felt slick and alien against her skin. She was used to the scratch of cheap polyester blends and the rhythmic, sagging squeak of her futon in the Bronx. This bed felt like a coffin made of clouds. She tried to push herself up and the world violently tilted on its axis. A heavy dead weight anchored her left side. She looked down. Her arm from the knuckles to midway up her bicep was encased in thick, stark white plaster. Dr. Evans had done his work. The throbbing agony that had previously consumed her entire consciousness was dialed down to a hot, localized ache, muffled by the heavy narcotics swimming in her bloodstream. Fiona swung her legs over the edge of the mattress. Her bare feet hit the plush rug. Nausea rolled through her stomach in a hot, sickening wave, forcing her to swallow hard and close her eyes until the room stopped spinning. Tommy. The name punched through the chemical fog in her brain. If the rail yard was empty, if Sullivan was dead, the fallout would be catastrophic. Word travelled fast on the south side. The vacuum left by a wiped-out crew would draw scavengers by dawn, and if any of Sullivan's bookies were still breathing, they would call in their markers before fleeing. Tommy wouldn't know. He would walk out of his shift at the auto body shop and straight into a meat grinder. She needed a phone. She spotted a heavy cream-coloured rotary dial on the nightstand. She lurched toward it, her balance severely thrown off by the plaster cast. She grabbed the receiver with her right hand, dragging it to her ear. No dial tone. The line was completely dead. The heavy brass handle of the bedroom door clicked. Fiona jumped backward, her spine hitting the edge of a heavy oak dresser. The wood dug into her bruised ribs, drawing a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain through her teeth. Kieran walked in. He didn't look like the untouchable, immaculate predator who had sat behind the mahogany desk 12 hours ago. The pristine illusion was fractured. His dark overcoat was gone. His suit jacket was slung carelessly over his shoulder, the fabric marred by dark, wet streaks of mud and a powdery white residue that smelled sharply of quicklime. His silk tie had been ripped away. The top 3 buttons of his white dress shirt were undone, revealing the faint, bruised shadow of a collarbone. But it was his hands that made Fiona's breath catch in her throat. His knuckles were raw, split open in jagged, ugly fissures. Dark, dried blood flaked around his cuticles and stained the stark white cuffs of his shirt. He smelled of ozone-burnt diesel and the heavy, sickening copper stench of an abattoir. It was the scent of a man who had just spent the night doing terrible physical labor. He stopped a few feet inside the room. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her. His slate-grey eyes were bloodshot, ringed with deep, bruised exhaustion, yet they tracked her with the terrifying, unblinking focus of a reptile. "You shouldn't be standing," Kieran said. His voice was a raspy, hollow rasp, entirely devoid of inflection. "My brother," Fiona croaked. Her throat felt full of sand. "I need to use the phone. The line is cut." "I pulled the junction box downstairs," Kieran replied, tossing his ruined jacket onto a velvet armchair. It hit the upholstery with a heavy metallic thud that suggested the pistol was still in the pocket. "Nobody makes outbound calls from this estate today. The police scanners have been screaming since 4 in the morning." Fiona gripped the edge of the dresser, her knuckles turning white. "What did you do?" It was a stupid question. She knew exactly what he had done. She could smell it on him. Kieran walked slowly toward the small ensuite bathroom attached to the guest room. He stopped at the doorway, resting his hand on the frame. He looked utterly drained, yet practically vibrating with an ugly residual adrenaline. "Declan Sullivan no longer holds any paper in this city," Kieran said, his tone clinical, as if reporting a dip in the stock market. His chop shop burned to the foundation due to an unfortunate electrical fire. The 15 men inside were unaccounted for before the roof collapsed. Fiona's stomach bottomed out. 15 men. Gone. Erased between the hours of midnight and dawn, all because she couldn't carry a silver tray without flinching. The sheer disproportionate scale of the violence made her want to vomit. "You killed them," she whispered, the reality finally stripping away the last of her morphine haze. "All of them. I corrected an oversight," Kieran corrected, turning the brass tap in the bathroom sink. The water roared to life, loud and harsh in the quiet room. "I told you. A man throws a rock at my house, I burn his down. It's the basic economics of respect." He shoved his ruined hands under the rushing water. The water, pooling in the porcelain basin, instantly turned a watery, rust-colored pink. He reached for a bar of soap, working up a thick lather over his split knuckles. The soap stung. She could see the muscles in his forearms jump and twitch, but his face remained a blank, emotionless mask. "I need to leave," Fiona said, her voice shaking violently. "I have to find Tommy. I have to get him out of the city. Tommy is downstairs," Kieran said over the sound of the running water. Fiona froze. The blood drained entirely from her face. "What?" Kieran rinsed his hands, grabbed a thick white towel, and methodically dried his fingers. He tossed the damp towel onto the counter and leaned against the doorframe, looking at her with an expression that bordered on absolute boredom. "Gage picked him up from his apartment 3 hours ago," Kieran said. "He's currently sitting in my kitchen drinking orange juice and trying very hard not to soil his pants. You don't need to run anywhere, Fiona. The ledger is clean." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers, stripping away any illusion of salvation. "But we are going to have a very clear conversation about what happens next." Tommy looked exactly like what he was, a 22-year-old kid who had spent the last week waiting for a bullet to find the back of his head. He sat rigid on a tall steel stool at the massive marble island in the center of Kieran's kitchen. He was drowning in a faded, oversized mechanic's jacket, his knees bouncing in a frantic, ceaseless rhythm. When Fiona walked into the kitchen, wearing a pair of borrowed sweatpants and clutching her heavy plaster cast to her chest, Tommy practically fell off the stool. "Fee!" He choked out, his voice cracking. He scrambled around the counter, grabbing her by her good shoulder. He smelled like stale beer engine grease and cold sweat. He looked at the massive white, cast his eyes widening in horror. "Jesus Christ! He said you got hurt, but... Godfrey, I'm so sorry. I'm so stupid. I'm so sorry." "I'm fine, Tommy." She lied, her voice tight. She pulled him into a desperate one-armed hug, burying her face in the greasy collar of his jacket. He was shaking like a leaf. She could feel his ribs through his shirt. He had stopped eating days ago. "It's set. It doesn't hurt. Are you okay?" "Did they hurt you?" "No," Tommy babbled, pulling back to look at her frantically. "Some huge guy with a scar just kicked my door in, told me to put my shoes on and drove me here. Fee, what the hell is going on? The news is going crazy. They're saying Sullivan's yard exploded. They're saying it's a mob war." "It's not a war," a flat, gravelly voice interrupted. Tommy flinched violently, stepping behind Fiona, as if her broken body could act as a shield. Kieran walked into the kitchen. He had showered. He wore a simple black t-shirt and dark slacks, his wet hair combed back sharply from his forehead. The blood and the grime were gone, but the heavy, suffocating gravity he carried with him remained entirely intact. He walked straight to the commercial espresso machine, sitting on the far counter, completely ignoring Tommy's terror. He methodically loaded a portafilter, the sharp metallic clinks and grinds echoing loudly against the subway tile walls. The smell of dark roast coffee quickly filled the massive room, familiar and grounding, yet entirely out of place amidst the suffocating tension. "Wars require 2 armies," Kieran said over his shoulder, locking the filter into place and flipping a heavy silver switch. The machine hissed and spat dark, thick liquid into a ceramic cup. "Sullivan didn't have an army. He had a collection of scrap metal thieves and junkies. It was a pest control issue, nothing more. Tommy swallowed loudly. Mr. Hayes. Sir. I don't know how to thank you. The 30 grand. I swear to God, I'll pay you back. I'll get a second job. I'll give you every paycheck. Kieran turned around, holding the small ceramic cup. He leaned his hip against the marble counter, taking a slow sip. His dark, bruised eyes assessed Tommy the way a butcher assesses a cheap cut of meat. You don't make enough in a year to cover the fuel costs for the vans I used last night, Kieran stated plainly, let alone the hazard pay for my crew, the clean-up costs, and the absolute headache of managing the police brass this morning. You owe me significantly more than $30,000, Thomas. Fiona felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of her stomach. She stepped slightly in front of her brother. You said the ledger was clean. Sullivan's ledger is clean, Kieran corrected, lowering the espresso cup, because I burned it. But the fundamental law of the universe is conservation of energy, Fiona. Debt doesn't vanish. It transfers. He set the cup down on the marble with a definitive clack. Here is the new reality, Kieran said, his tone devoid of malice, which somehow made it vastly more terrifying. It was simply business. Thomas, you no longer work at the auto body shop. You work for Gage. You will sweep the brass at the firing ranges. You will wash the vehicles. You will load the crates at the docks. You will do exactly what you are told when you are told, and you will never ever gamble another dime for the rest of your natural life. Do you understand? Tommy nodded frantically, his face pale. Yes, absolutely. Anything. Kieran ignored him, shifting his gaze to Fiona. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. And you? Kieran said quietly. Fiona held her breath. The throbbing in her arms spiked, pulsing with the frantic rhythm of her heart. You are no longer a day maid, Kieran continued. You will pack your belongings from your apartment. You will move into the staff quarters on the 3rd floor of this house. You will manage the inventory, the cleaning staff schedules, and the kitchen logistics. You will be on call 24 hours a day. I have a cast on my arm, Fiona said, her voice shaking with a mix of defiance and absolute terror. I can't scrub floors. I didn't ask you to scrub floors. I asked you to manage the people who do. Kieran pushed off the counter, walking slowly toward her. Tommy instinctively shrank back, but Fiona stood her ground, though her knees felt like water. Kieran stopped 2 feet away. He reached out his split, bruised knuckles, hovering just an inch from the plaster shell encasing her arm. He didn't touch it. He just stared at the damage he now owned. You are mine now, Kieran said softly, the words lacking any romantic warmth, sounding instead like an iron shackle snapping shut. Both of you. You breathe my air. You eat my food. You live under my roof. And in exchange, nobody in this city will ever look at you twice. You are under my protection. He finally looked up, his slate eyes locking onto hers. But understand this, Fiona. The door to this house only locks from the outside. You belong to the estate now. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving the faint scent of coffee and the heavy, undeniable weight of a cage falling over them. Fiona stared at the empty doorway, clutching her broken arm, realizing with a sickening clarity that she hadn't been saved. She had just been purchased. Plaster didn't breathe. It swallowed sweat, trapped dead skin, and turned a stark, clinical white into a dull, scuffed grey within a week. Fiona sat at the small clawfoot writing desk in her new quarters on the 3rd floor, dragging the smooth, wooden end of a wooden knitting needle down the inside of her cast. The relief was instantaneous, a sharp, borderline painful scratch against the agonizing itch of healing bone. She pulled the needle out, dropping it onto a stack of supplier invoices, and let out a long, ragged exhale. Her new room smelled of lemon oil, old lavender sachets, and the faint, persistent dust of a space that hadn't been lived in for a decade. It was larger than her entire apartment in the Bronx. A heavy oak bed dominated the center, flanked by brass lamps and a massive armoire. It was a beautiful room. It felt exactly like a solitary confinement cell lined in velvet. 3 weeks had passed since the night the sky over the rail yard turned a violent, bruised orange. In that time, the dynamics of the estate had fundamentally shifted, isolating Fiona in a bizarre, terrifying purgatory. She was no longer a maid. She was the ghost who walked the halls with a crippled arm carrying a clipboard. The other girls, women she had shared cheap cigarettes and complaints with by the dumpsters, now dropped their eyes when she entered a room. They didn't speak to her unless spoken to. They moved out of her way with the frantic, scurrying energy of mice avoiding a snake. They knew. Nobody had explicitly told them what had happened to Sullivan's crew, but the South Side breathed rumors, and the sudden explosive elevation of a bruised day maid to house manager painted a very clear, very bloody picture. She was radioactive. She was the woman Kieran Hayes had burned down a city block for. Fiona hated it. She hated the silence. She hated the way the heavy silver keys on her belt jingled in the quiet hallways, announcing her arrival like a warden. But most of all, she hated the twisted, nauseating knot of relief that sat heavy in her stomach every night when she locked her door. She didn't flinch at shadows anymore. Tommy wasn't dodging phone calls. The crushing, suffocating weight of poverty and debt had been surgically removed, replaced by the crushing, suffocating weight of Kieran Hayes. A sharp knock broke the stillness of her room. "Come in," Fiona called out, sitting up straighter and pulling her oversized grey cardigan over the top edge of her cast. The door opened. It wasn't one of the maids. It was Gage. The massive enforcer filled the doorway, smelling of damp wool and cold tobacco. He didn't step inside. He never did. He treated Fiona with a careful, measured distance, as if she were a live explosive resting on a table. "Boss wants the monthly household ledgers." Gage grunted, his eyes fixed on the wall above her head. "And he wants his dinner in the main study. He's skipping the dining room tonight." Fiona swallowed her throat, suddenly dry. "I'll bring the ledgers down. Tell the kitchen staff to prepare his tray." "Kitchen staff went home an hour ago, Fiona. It's past 9. Gage shifted his weight. "You're the manager. You manage it." He turned and walked down the hall, his heavy boots silent on the thick carpet. Fiona closed her eyes for a brief, miserable second. 20 minutes later, she balanced a silver tray against her hip, using her good hand to steady a plate of cold roast beef, sharp cheddar, and half a loaf of crusty sourdough. The ledgers were tucked awkwardly under her broken arm, pressing painfully against her ribs, which still ached with a dull, bruised rhythm. She reached the heavy oak doors of the study. She didn't knock. He hated knocking when he was expecting someone. She pushed the handle down with her elbow and slipped inside. The study was dim, lit only by a brass banker's lamp on the mahogany desk and the dying embers in the massive stone fireplace. Kieran was leaning back in his leather chair, his reading glasses perched low on the bridge of his nose. He was reviewing a stack of shipping manifests, holding a tumbler of amber liquid in his right hand. He didn't look up when she entered. Fiona crossed the room, the silence stretching taut. She reached the desk and awkwardly shunted the tray onto the polished wood. The plate clattered slightly. She winced, expecting a reprimand, but Kieran simply turned a page. "The ledgers," Fiona said, quietly sliding the heavy leather-bound books from under her, cast onto the corner of the desk. Kieran finally raised his eyes. They were exhausted, the dark circles underneath, standing out starkly against his pale skin. He looked at the books, then at the tray, and finally at her. He took a slow sip of his scotch. "You're losing weight," he observed. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp in the quiet room. Fiona stiffened. "I'm eating fine, sir." "You're eating like a bird that expects the cage door to slam shut on its neck," Kieran replied, pulling his glasses off and tossing them onto the desk. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the blotter. "Your cheekbones look like they could cut glass, and the dark circles under your eyes suggest you haven't slept more than 3 hours a night since you moved upstairs." Fiona looked away, staring at the embers in the fireplace. "It's a new bed. It takes getting used to." "It's fear," Kieran corrected bluntly. "You're lying awake waiting for me to walk upstairs and collect the debt." The raw, unvarnished truth of his words hung in the air, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Fiona's fingers curled into fists against her thighs. She forced herself to look back at him. "Can you blame me? You told me I belonged to you. You killed 15 men over a $30,000 gambling debt. What am I supposed to think?" Kieran didn't blink. He reached out and picked up a piece of the sharp cheddar from the plate, inspecting it for a second before dropping it back down. "I killed 15 men because Declan Sullivan was siphoning shipping crates from my South Docks for 6 months, and he needed to be made an example of." Kieran said, his tone entirely conversational. "The fact that he hit a woman who resided under my roof simply provided the necessary public justification for a sweep. It demonstrated that I protect my assets, all of them, down to the bottom of the payroll." Fiona felt a cold shock of betrayal, quickly followed by a dark, cynical wave of understanding. "So I was just a convenient excuse." "You were a catalyst," Kieran corrected smoothly. "A very poorly timed, badly bruised catalyst. If you think I leveled a city block out of some twisted romantic chivalry, you have been reading too many cheap novels, Fiona. I am a businessman. I balance ledgers." The words should have stung. They should have made her feel small, insignificant, and used. Instead, a strange, perverse sense of relief washed over her. He wasn't obsessed with her. He didn't burn down a building for love. He did it for power. Power, she understood. Power was a currency that could be predicted. Unhinged, violent infatuation could not. "Then why keep us here?" Fiona asked, her voice steadying. "If I'm just an asset, why move me upstairs? Why give Tommy a job?" Kieran picked up his tumbler. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. He studied the amber liquid for a long time before answering. "Because you didn't break," he said quietly. Fiona frowned. "My arm is in a cast." "Your bone snapped," Kieran said, looking up, his slate eyes pinning her to the spot. "Your mind didn't. You stood in this office dragging a shattered arm across my desk, and your only concern was keeping your $12 an hour job to protect your idiot brother. You lied to my face to absorb the violence yourself. Most of the hardened men on my payroll would have folded in half and sold their mothers to avoid the pain you walked in here with." He set the glass down. The sharp clack echoed loudly. "Loyalty like that is rare. It cannot be bought. It has to be harnessed." He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. "You manage this house because I know, without a shadow of a doubt, that you will protect the things you are responsible for. And Tommy washes my trucks, because as long as I hold his leash, you will never betray me." Fiona stared at him, feeling the true weight of her invisible collar for the first time. It wasn't made of lust or malice. It was made of cold, calculated utility. He had analyzed her trauma, quantified her love for her brother, and weaponized both to secure a loyal manager. It was brilliant. It was utterly sociopathic. "You're a monster," she whispered. The words slipped out before she could catch them. Kieran didn't react. He didn't even flinch. He just looked at her with a heavy, ancient exhaustion. "Yes," he agreed softly. "But I'm the monster, keeping the wolves away from your brother's door. I'm the monster putting food on your plate." He gestured lazily to the heavy oak doors behind her. "You are free to walk out of that door right now, Fiona. Gage won't stop you. I won't stop you. You can go back to the Bronx. You can go back to waiting tables with one hand. And you can wait for the next bottom feeder to decide Tommy owes him blood." He picked up a pen, turning his attention back to the shipping manifests. The conversation was over. "Or." Kieran added the scratch of the nib against the heavy paper, resuming its rhythmic, indifferent sound. "You can eat your dinner, go to sleep in a warm bed, and accept the fact that your survival requires a certain amount of moral flexibility." Fiona stood frozen on the Persian rug. Her ribs ached. Her arm throbbed. The smell of cedarwood, cold coffee and gunpowder filled her lungs. She looked at the door. She thought about the damp, freezing draft in her old apartment. She thought about the terror in Tommy's eyes when Sullivan's men had cornered her in the alley. She thought about the heavy, crushing certainty of Kieran Hayes's protection. Slowly, deliberately, Fiona turned her back to the door. She reached forward with her good hand, pulled the plate of cold roast beef across the desk and picked up a piece of the bread. She took a bite. The sourdough was dry, heavy, and tasted faintly of ash, but she chewed it mechanically, forcing it down her dry throat. Kieran didn't look up from his paperwork, but as the silence settled over the study, heavy and absolute, the scratching of his pen slowed just a fraction. A silent, terrifying acknowledgement that she had made her choice. She belonged to the house now. Sunlight filtered through the heavy velvet drapes, casting long, pale ribbons across the hardwood floor of the third-floor bedroom. Fiona lay perfectly still. Her left arm rested atop the thick down duvet, a solid white anchor holding her down. The agonizing, blinding throb had finally surrendered, degrading into a deep, manageable ache, a permanent, heavy resident in her bones. She didn't scramble out of bed in a blind panic. For the first time in 6 years, the quiet hum of the morning didn't feel like a starting gun for a race she was destined to lose. She dressed awkwardly, wrestling a loose black silk blouse over the bulky plaster cast. It was expensive fabric found hanging in her massive armoire 2 days ago without a note. It smelled faintly of unscented lye soap and cold, untouchable money. She carefully pinned the empty left sleeve up to her shoulder, hiding the raw utility of the cast beneath the elegant drape of the silk. Downstairs, the estate's kitchen vibrated with a tense, muffled energy. 4 maids were scrubbing the industrial stainless steel stoves, their movements jerky and overly loud in a desperate attempt to look busy. When Fiona crossed the threshold, the scrubbing stopped entirely. A heavy, suffocating quiet descended thick enough to choke on. "Sarah," Fiona said. Her voice sounded entirely alien to her own ears. Flatter, heavier, stripped of the frantic, "please don't fire me" edge she had carried for years. "The silver in the formal dining room needs polishing before noon. And check the basement inventory on the heavy cream. We were short yesterday." Sarah, a woman 10 years Fiona's senior who used to trade complaints and half-smoked cigarettes with her by the dumpsters, swallowed hard. She didn't look Fiona in the eye. She bobbed her head, staring at the polished floorboards. "Right away, Miss Fiona." "Miss?" The title tasted like copper and ash. Fiona didn't correct her. She couldn't. The divide was already carved in stone. She just gave a single tight nod, picked up a fresh cup of black coffee with her good hand, and walked out. The scrubbing resumed instantly behind her, a frantic, desperate scratching. She wasn't their friend anymore. She was the warden, outside the gravel driveway, crunched under the heavy tires of a black security SUV. Fiona stood on the expansive back terrace, the cold morning air biting through her thin silk blouse. Down by the massive detached garages, Tommy was dragging a soapy sponge across the hood of a bulletproof Mercedes. He wore heavy rubber boots and a dark blue mechanic's coverall. He paused, wiping his sweating forehead with the back of his wrist, and looked up toward the terrace. For a long, stretched second, they just stared at each other, across the manicured, dew-soaked lawn. Tommy looked utterly exhausted, his shoulders permanently slumped under the weight of his new reality. But the frantic, hunted energy that had defined his existence for the past month, the terrifying twitch of a boy waiting for a bullet, was completely gone. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. He gave her a small, tight nod. Fiona nodded back. They were alive. They were fed. The cost of their souls felt like a remarkably cheap price to pay. Footsteps sounded on the terrace behind her, slow, deliberate, and perfectly spaced. Fiona didn't turn around. She took a sip of her coffee, letting the bitter heat ground her stomach. The scent of cedarwood, cold leather, and the faint, ever-present ghost of gunpowder wrapped around her before he even reached the stone balustrade. Kieran leaned against the railing beside her. He wore a dark charcoal suit, flawlessly tailored. The violent, bruised exhaustion of the previous night was entirely masked behind a clean shave and a perfectly knotted silk tie. His split knuckles were the only remaining evidence of the monster, now neatly concealed by the deep pockets of his slacks. He didn't look at her. His slate-grey eyes swept the perimeter with the cold, calculating possessiveness of a predator surveying a closed trap. "The new security protocols for the South Gate are on your desk," Kieran murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated over the distant sound of Tommy's hose hitting the concrete. "I want the night shift doubled. Review the rotation and give me your approval by dinner." Approval. Fiona repeated the word heavy and strange on her tongue. She finally turned her head to look at his profile, the sharp, unforgiving line of his jaw, the absolute lack of warmth. "You don't need my approval for anything, sir." "I don't need your permission," Kieran corrected, softly, turning his head just enough to meet her gaze. "I need your administration. You are the filter this house runs through now. If something is broken, you fix it. If someone is a liability, you report it. You keep the internal machinery running, and I keep the outside world from tearing the walls down." It was a transaction, brutal, efficient, and entirely stripped of any romantic illusion. Fiona looked back out at the driveway. Tommy had moved on to the tires, scrubbing the rims with a heavy, stiff-bristled brush. The water washed the black grease away, leaving the rubber gleaming in the grey light. "I'll have the rotation approved by 5, Fiona said. Her voice didn't shake. The pure, blinding terror that had kept her shivering on his study floor felt like it belonged to a different woman in a different lifetime. Kieran watched her for a long moment. He noted the rigidly straight line of her spine, the steady grip of her right hand on the porcelain cup, the way she had pinned the empty sleeve of her blouse to accommodate the heavy cast he had paid to set. She was adapting to the cage. She was learning to like the shape of the bars. He reached out. His movement was slow, highly telegraphed. He didn't touch her face, and he didn't offer a comforting hand to her shoulder. His long fingers simply brushed the heavy silver ring of master keys clipped to her belt. The metal chimed softly, a delicate binding sound that hung in the cold morning air. "Good morning, Fiona," Kieran said. His tone dropped an octave, carrying the faintest, darkest hint of absolute satisfaction. He turned and walked back into the house, leaving her alone on the terrace. Fiona stood there, feeling the lingering weight of the keys against her hip. She took another sip of her coffee, closed her eyes, and breathed in the cold, expensive air of the estate. She had sold herself to the devil. But as she listened to the rhythmic, safe sound of her brother washing the devil's car, she realized one chilling, irreversible truth. She didn't want a refund.